We can then start with our last paper. It's given by Dr. Brian Bajzek, who is visiting assistant professor at Marquette University. And the title of Brian's paper is Form, Face, and Otherness, Cruciform Church as Event of Intersubjectivity. And the respondent will be Patrick Nolin, who is a doctoral student from Regis College in the Toronto School of Theology. Thank you very much for being with us. And Brian, I turn it over to you.
All right, you can hear me, right? Because I'm gonna switch. I was gonna
Yes.
say I need to switch windows, and it would be very bad if I started reading. It didn't work. Okay, cool. I will hop over. So to begin, I want to express my gratitude to Darren, Joseph, and all the other members of the International Institute for Method and Theology, the Marquette Lonergan Project, and the Center for the Advancement of the Humanities at Marquette. I'm also grateful to Patrick Nolin for agreeing to respond to my paper, especially because I sent it to him a little later than I should have. It's the peril of trying to cut down a fully finished article and make it a presentation length. I suspect we'll have a lot to think about and discuss together, and I want to also thank Anne, Benjamin, Kate, and Eric for the insights they've already offered us in the earlier sessions. My paper today is a continuation of a long-running project rooted in dialogue between Bernard Lonergan and Emmanuel Levinas, exploring the resources they provide for expanding our understanding of intersubjectivity, developing an ethics of alterity and embodiment, and exploring different types of differences. This paper was also prompted by my experiences this past semester teaching a graduate intro to systematic theology. Included in the syllabus was a selection of readings from Hans Urs von Balthasar, about whom we just heard a lot in Kate's paper and the following Q&A. Over the course of the semester, some interesting trends emerged. Chief among these was the difficulty of bridging the gap between the theories and methods of the theologians we read and the concrete lived experience of faith. This was especially evident whenever the conversations turned to social justice and the connections between the church, the world, ethics, etc. Notably, our conversations often implicitly involved questions of who counts as church, whether all ecclesial actions are inherently ethical, and what might provide the litmus test for genuine Christian praxis. My experiences last semester reinforced my conviction that if systematic theology is going to overcome this all too common impasse, it also faces the difficulty of doing so in an increasingly polarized cultural matrix, wherein challenging questions are often met with ecclesial indifference. Now, this isn't a new problem. Many theologians have spent entire careers identifying and opposing the myriad ways indifference and ignorance insinuate themselves into arguably all church contexts, falsely impeding ecclesial interaction with so-called earthly affairs. Christians identify ourselves with the one who states, "Truly I tell you, just as you do to one of the least of those who are members of my family, you do to me." But we have a long history of restricting the scope of this exhortation. In today's paper, my own attempts at overcoming such indifference will involve the suggestion that there is a direct, often overlooked connection between the ways we understand and define the church and how we frame said church's engagement with contemporary ethical concerns, especially in terms of otherness. This brings me to another trend that emerged last semester, one that involved my own engagement with the course material. I found myself repeatedly drawing connections between Levinas's account of the divine trace encountered in and through the face of the other, Lonergan's analysis of intersubjectivity, and von Balthasar's presentation of Gestalt, or form. More specifically, I found myself fascinated by von Balthasar's understanding of creation as inherently Christiform, with the divine logos animating and sustaining all things, a divine intelligence and intelligibility in and through which all things possess any existence and meaning, reverberating through creation as the beauty by which all things meaningfully inhere in both oneness and multiplicity. Here, I must acknowledge that, like most of my theological interests, the possible connection between themes in von Balthasar, Levinas, and Lonergan is indebted to Bob Doran and John Dodosky. I just realized before this paper, I have both of their pictures on my wall. In his article, Lonergan and von Balthasar, Methodological Considerations, Doran emphasized the importance a von Balthasar-Lonergan dialogue could hold for the future of Catholic theology, highlighting how von Balthasar's creative application of special theological categories might bolster Lonergan's nuanced approach to categories derived from generalized empirical method, and vice versa. Didowski has echoed this in his own reflections on the future of ecclesiology. So Doran and Didowski's suggestions do, however, present a tension with an argument offered by another theologian to whom my work is indebted, Joseph Kamonczak. In his 2008 Père Marquette lecture, Who Are the Church?, Kamonczak is critical of certain emphases in von Balthasar's ecclesiology, and his criticisms stem largely from von Balthasar's, I would say perhaps overapplied by Kamonczak, tendency to speak of the church as a singular personal entity, as opposed to Kamonczak's framing church as event of intersubjectivity, a phrase repeated in the title for my talk today. Interestingly, my experiences engaging von Balthasar with my students last semester convinced me that his writings capture significantly more of this intersubjective sense than Kamonczak acknowledges in that lecture. His writings also provide insights, that is, Balthasar's writings also provide insights by which I hope to develop connections between intersubjectivity and contemporary ethical concerns, especially in terms of the church's treatment of those considered other. I find this intersubjective element especially resonant with von Balthasar's analysis of Gestalt, Christ, the cross, and, Kamonczak's objections notwithstanding, the church. Drawing from Lonergan, Levinas, and von Balthasar, I will suggest that, if Kamonczak is correct, and I believe he is, that the church is an event of intersubjectivity, then our intersubjectivity with Christ is paramount to unpacking the form of an authentic ecclesiology. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I need to unpack what I mean by intersubjectivity and its potential impact upon the idea of church. Next, I will give an admittedly quite brief overview of the resonances I see between these themes and von Balthasar's writings. Lastly, I will bring the ideas of intersubjectivity, form, face, and otherness into conversation, exploring the possibilities these connections might provide for drawing the church into greater conformity with Christ, and therefore into greater cruciformity. To begin, I need to briefly summarize part of my own work, bridging Lonergan's and Levinas's positions on intersubjectivity and ethical relationality. Central to my project is the contention that Lonergan's under-resourced articulations of a pre-intentional, sensitive psychic we, that is, intersubjectivity, linking all subjects together prior to the individuation of I and thou, can be bolstered by Levinas's arguments for the primordial, pre-reflective responsibility for the other. According to Lonergan, the prior we of intersubjectivity underpins, overarches, and accompanies the entire range of relational attentiveness, intelligence, reasonableness, responsibility, and lovingness. It informs all human encounter, even manifesting itself in spontaneous, pre-reflective aid for other human beings. Lonergan calls instances of such aid spontaneous intersubjective acts, and his favorite example of such spontaneous aid is his own experience of reaching out for a falling child with the same pre-reflexive aid and concern with which he would ward off a blow to his own head. I'm convinced that such acts are responses to the psychic exigence toward and responsibility for the other identified by Levinas. According to Levinas, the ethical obligation to the other is both always already present and radically re-presented in each face-to-face encounter. Levinas concretizes the we of intersubjectivity by placing the ethical onus of this on the first person plural, placing the ethical onus of this first person plural on the first person singular. The gaze of the other ruptures the horizons of my self-satisfied subjectivity. It calls me into question, presenting me with a choice. I can afford the other the dignity she deserves, or I can assert my own ego, impose my own will, and in the limit case, murder her. In this encounter, the face of the other exposes me to the divine injunction, thou shalt not kill. And so I am faced with what Levinas terms eleity, the trace of the divine. This divinely originated command obligates me into a complete transformation, reorienting my being in the world as being for the other. This responsibility is primordial, perhaps always already present, prior to any reflection, but explicitly manifested in the face-to-face encounter with the other. According to Levinas, such encounter reawakens me to the fact that, although I may not be actively harming my fellow human beings, avoiding my relational responsibilities makes me complicit in their pain, even their death. This, quote, puts me on the spot, calls me into question, as if I, by my possible indifference, become the accomplice of that death. It is precisely in that recalling of me to my responsibility by the face that summons me, that demands me, that requires me. It is in that calling into question that the other is my neighbor, end quote. Now, Levinas argues that the faces of all others exhort me toward a radical self-forgetfulness, but he repeatedly emphasizes the importance of response to the marginalized, utilizing the biblical, prophetic exemplars of the poor, the widow, the foreigner, and the orphan as those others to whom we ought to be most attentive. Paralleling the Christian category of the preferential option for the poor, which is certainly not restricted to Christianity, Levinas's thought prioritizes those rendered least among us, and he writes and speaks of accountability to those othered most in terms of a prophetic election, carrying biblical significance. If I'm truly being for the other, I am responding to the word of God, and so I meet this exigence by saying, here I am, and send me. Such being for the other incarnates one of the deepest truths of human life. None of us, and I would add to that, especially when talking about ecclesiology, no group of us exists as an island. We are all linked to one another, obligated by this connection prior to any and all reflection. Subjectivity, therefore, is always already inherently intersubjective, and this foundational facet of human being is concretized and represented in each encounter. My own work with Lonergan, Levinas, and René Girard has led me to argue that, although intersubjectivity is a natural, spontaneous element of being human, each of us must develop those habits that foster authentic intersubjectivity, a task which is, to quote Lonergan, ever precarious. It requires conversion and collaboration, integrating the sensitive psyche and the intellectual spiritual dimension of consciousness, cooperating with grace and becoming beings in love, or to use Levinas's parallel term, beings for the other. This integrates the intersubjective and the interpersonal in the habit that Levinas names non-indifference. Such non-indifference is a taking ownership of one's connection to all others, meeting the needs of each particular other by bearing their sufferings, saying, here I am, even when, and perhaps especially when, here is a place of danger. Now, I'm guessing many of you are asking a valid question. When will Brian start actually talking about the church? Furthermore, how does all of this connect to Kamenchik and von Balthasar? In what follows, I want to suggest that the key to answering these valid questions lies at the intersection of the we of intersubjectivity, replying here I am to the ethical exigence of the face of the other, and another of Lonergan's favorite topics, meaning. To connect these dots, it's time to turn to Kamenchik's ecclesiology. Kamenchik's writings quite ardently name and critique the tendency to reify, even calcify, the church as supra-personal, as if the church were some entity sitting somewhere independent of, or as some ecclesiologists imply, above the morass of a sinful human world. Now, this may sound like a caricature, but think of the primary pronouns with which you, your pastor, your family, your friends, or your students speak about the church. It, maybe that, maybe even she, but us and we, this is, at least in my experience, less common. The words we use matter, and the ways we speak shape us. Reducing the church to a supra-personal entity has consequences, building up barriers concerning who ought to be included in or prioritized by an ecclesial body. Relating such mediations of meaning to Kamenchik, we can contrast a supra-personal, disembodied understanding of the church with communities mediated by meaning and motivated by value. Kamenchik writes, quote, there are entities that do not exist apart from human acts of meaning and value. One may think, for example, of friendships and marriages, of communities and committees, of universities and governments. Apart from acts of collective intentionality, these entities don't exist. Their ontology is subjective and intersubjective. One may think of community, for example, which on Lonergan's analysis begins and ends where common experience, common understanding, common judgments, and common decisions begin and end, end quote. These relational realities do not occupy literal physical space, at least not in the sense of being equivalent with or reductively tethered to a single aggregate of physical data. But they are still very real. To give one example, I cannot technically point to Toronto in its entirety as datum, and I cannot point to the Canadian economy. As someone who took on a decent amount of student debt in Toronto, however, I can confirm that this lack of singular physical correlate does not mean that Canada and its economy are not meaningful or very real. As Lonergan points out, quote, "The real is the concrete universe of being and not a subdivision of the already out there now, the sensible," end quote. I can recognize the intelligibility of the nation of Canada and its economy as immanent in a set of concrete data, and I can reasonably affirm their existence and impact upon millions of lives. They have being. Similarly, Kamanchik argues that the church is a real community existing within the world mediated by meaning, a messy world, bound up in cycles of progress and decline, but suffused with and sustained by the grace necessary for redemption. He points out that the single question haunting him since he began teaching ecclesiology has concerned the tension between, on the one hand, quote, "the glorious things that are said in the Bible and in the tradition about the church," and on the other hand, "the concrete community of limited and sinful people who gather as the church at any time or place all around the world," end quote. This tension is exacerbated by our tendency to speak, in Kamanchik's words, quote, "as if there is an entity somewhere above human beings, a suprapersonal entity corresponding to the images of the church, that is, whatever these images say it is, that does whatever they say it does, apart from concrete men and women and their communities," end quote. According to Kamanchik, one example of this tendency can be found in Hans Urs von Balthasar's referring to the church as the she in which real subjects share. According to Kamanchik, von Balthasar sees little use for what von Balthasar in Who is the Church, an article that Kamanchik is explicitly responding to, calls, quote, "the fictitious and accidental attribution," end quote, "of a collective nature to the church." And so Balthasar asks the central ecclesial question in the singular, who is the church? Kamanchik does not like this. In Who are the church, Kamanchik obviously reframes this question in the plural. Why does he do this? Because he understands the church to be a social phenomenon, and he argues that, quote, "any answer to the question about the referent of the word will always refer to a group of people, to real subjects," end quote. For Kamanchik, the church are the real subjects. The real subjects, whether in heaven or in earth, on earth, are the church. This has a practical impact upon the difficulties that haunted Kamanchik's reflections on interpersonal inauthenticity and structural sinfulness in a church named as holy. Now, as Lumen Gentium asserts, quote, "one is not to think of the church's spiritual and structural components as two realities, but as forming a single complex entity, complex reality that comes together from a divine and from a human element," end quote. This complicates things because ecclesiology can't shy away from the tension between what Kamanchik calls the glorious things that are said in the Bible and the tradition about the church and the obvious sinfulness and shortcomings of ecclesial reality. As I'll highlight below, these shortcomings include the tendency to both ignore the intersubjective exigence beckoning in and through alterity, and the tendency to actively exclude and marginalize because of religious or political affiliation, race, gender identity, sex, sexuality, etc. In contrast to the tendencies to depersonalize or desubjectivize the church, Kamanchik offers an integrating definition. The images, models, and words referring to the church are employed in reference to an assembly of believers, quote, "whether gathered in particular places or considered in their totality as the one worldwide church," end quote. The referent, the church, therefore, is both local and universal, and it refers to all members of the assembly, body, community of believers in Christ Jesus, spanning, quote, "the totality of history from creation until the return of Christ," end quote. Kamanchik notes that this concrete dialectic is common in the best of the Christian tradition's images of and interpretations of the church. This interpretive dynamism is what Kamanchik wants the contemporary church to recover, especially for articulating how the church is called to grow in holiness. We're caught between the already and the not yet. Because we're still operating within the not yet, Kamanchik stresses that, quote, "how broadly and how deeply Christ and his Spirit affect salvation will always be determined and displayed by the degree of holiness lived within the community of believers," end quote. Grace is, from a Catholic perspective, not irresistible, and neither is the healing and elevation it effects. This leads Kamanchik to admit, quote, There are degrees, in other words, in the self-realization of the church, end quote. I want to suggest that this self-realization directly connects to the response to the divine exhortation spoken in and through the faces of those most marginalized, the condition for the possibility of an authentic we, in which all subjects are intersubjectively authentic. I will also argue that von Balthasar's work provides perhaps unexpected tools for developing a theological ethics of embodied intersubjectivity, deepening the self-realization of a church often challenged by otherness. In Theology and the Dialectics of History, and the first two volumes, soon to be the third, as Joseph highlighted earlier, of the Trinity in History, Doran connects the ethical exigence underpinning intersubjectivity to a community, the church. He also highlights Christ's suffering servanthood as paradigmatic for such Christian community. Doran argues, quote, the incarnation is the personal entrance of God's meaning into history under intersubjective, aesthetic, symbolic, linguistic, and incarnate carriers, end quote. As the words spoken in and through the life, death, and resurrection of the incarnate word, who is this personal entrance of meaning into history, this meaning is the law of the cross, incarnated in the good that overwhelms evil with self-sacrificing love. As meaning, this law of the cross has very real being in the world, and I'm convinced that it is precisely what is demanded by the obligation manifested intersubjectively in the face of the other, that same meaning that Levinas identifies as thou shalt not kill. Now, I cannot stress strongly enough that Christians are not the only people that respond to this exhortation and perform self-giving actions that incarnate the law of the cross. I do believe, however, that explicitly identifying oneself as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth demands such self-emptying, other-oriented action, responding to the suffering of the marginalized with the "here I am, send me" that Levinas names as the acid test of authenticity. The church must be the community that most authentically meets this exigence, responding in solidarity with, deference to, and defense of those on the margins. As Pope Francis explicitly states in Gaudete et Exsultate, quote, holiness is not about swooning in mystic rapture, end quote. Instead, Francis concretizes the missional condition for and consequences of holiness, citing John Paul II, quote, if we truly start out anew from the contemplation of Christ, we must learn to see him, especially in the faces of those with whom he himself wished to be identified, end quote. In short, we need to recognize the exhortation to incarnate the law of the cross, calling out to us in and through the faces of those with whom Christ most explicitly identified. We also need to recognize that the law of the cross is incarnate whenever authentic actions performatively speak the words, I love you. Hate does not get the final say. Whether thematized as religious or not, this love participates in divine love, the only thing capable of subverting cycles of fear, scapegoating, marginalization, and violence. The demand to incarnate this law is presented proximately in all instances of encounter, as God's grace operatively exhorts us in and through the face of the other, calling us to relational attentiveness, intelligence, reasonableness, responsibility, and self-forgetful love. In extreme cases, like those Levinas's writings emphasize, this exhortation demands actions more easily recognizable as self-sacrificing, more clearly imaging the one Christians believe gave his life for all others. The response to this exigence is rooted in intersubjective spontaneity and interpersonal authenticity. If the church is to be an authentic we within the broader, always already intersubjective we of humanity, we need to be a community integrally and wholly responding to this exigence. We need to act in cruciform conformity with the one after whom we are named. We need to be a church for the other. This is where von Balthasar's insights into form, otherness, and the cross highlight the disorienting, unexpected beauty of the incarnate word that provides the formal element of any authentic Christian ecclesiology. It is to these insights that I will now finally turn. Von Balthasar's writings emphasize Christ's centrality as the form informing not just revelation, but the divine glory that shines in and through creation itself. The exact nature of the Christ Gestalt's role in von Balthasar's theology is difficult to summarize with a single quote or even a series of quotes. It's present all over his writings. For the sake of brevity, therefore, I'm going to rely heavily on the work of Anne Carpenter, who offers an illuminating summary in the following quotation from her book Theopoetics, echoing the radical dependency and humility stressed in Levinas's analyses of intersubjectivity. Quote, Christ is form in the most supreme sense possible. He in his humanity reveals the fullness of the depths of God, while the finitude of his humanity is preserved. So von Balthasar calls Jesus Christ the Father's temporal mirror in the flesh, emphasizing that the Son in the unity of his divinity and humanity reveals the Father to us. This revelation happens in fleshly finitude, not against it nor destroying it, end quote. The power of Christ perfectly imaging the Father reverberates through creation, and it does so without violently violating the relationship of the natural and the supernatural. Instead, as Carpenter observes, quote, the flesh of the Son expresses the Father, and in doing so, Christ in his flesh shows the way our fleshly nature is and ought to be open to God. Because of this focus on flesh, there's a sensible, visible quality to form. Christ reveals the Father uniquely, both eternally and in the economy of salvation, and he does so as the archetype, or built, of creation and the only Son of the Father. In a play on German prefixes, von Balthasar calls the Son the original image of the origin, the Urabbild des Ursprungs, that is, the original image of the Father, end quote. As missioned in perfect continuity with the actions of the Son, the Holy Spirit heals and elevates human nature, drawing us into ever greater conformity with this same Christ. Openness to sanctifying grace, from which the habit of self-donating charity flows, therefore, draws us into imitation of and participation in, to use Doran's language, the perfect perichoretic relationality of the Trinity. This same Trinity shines forth in the glory of the Lord that the Christ Gestalt perfectly mediates and incarnates. As Carpenter notes, quote, it is here that von Balthasar emphasizes self-gift, as God is eternal, triune self-gift, so we must give ourselves in the Spirit. What constitutes an authentic personality for von Balthasar is surrender. This is a surrender that imitates the Son's Eucharistic surrender on the cross, end quote. Here, I would suggest that the subtle interplay between grace, self-surrender, and cruciformity connects to the exhortation presented in the faces of those most marginalized, as this exigence for the other is grace operatively speaking a word, and this thou shalt not kill is what demands actions that incarnate the law of the cross. As the word become flesh, Christ takes attention already present in human existence, what Eric Chavara names the in and beyond relation between humanity and God, and frankly, creation and God, and embodies it. Jesus humbles himself relative to both his fellow human beings and his Father in heaven. In doing so, he draws vertical alterity, that is, the apophatic experience of dissimilarity between God and creation, into an unprecedented relationship with the similarity he shares with all of us, his humanity, and therefore his intersubjectivity with all human beings. By his act of perfect self-donation and humbling, all humanity is redeemed, drawn more deeply into communion with God. Christ's concrete universality connects all human connection, uniting our ethical responses to the intersubjective exhortation of alterity with his own intersubjectivity with his fellow human beings. In and through our imitation of and participation in the Christ form, all our responses to the obligation of the poor, the widow, the foreigner, and the orphan are inherently linked. We might say that as Doran puts it, the personal entrance of God's meaning into history, the Christ form is a wholly unique manifestation of meaning, providing the paradigm for responding to the exigence present in the faces of the most marginalized, with whom Christ most identifies. If Kamanchik is correct, and I believe he is, that the church is an event of intersubjectivity, then these connections between intersubjectivity, cross, grace, and meaning have consequences for what concrete participation in this ongoing intersubjective event means. I'm convinced that Balthasar's theological project foregrounds these same emphases, albeit under categories that often make it sound like he's saying something else. I think the categories are different, but the meaning's the same. I will conclude, therefore, by drawing from one of von Balthasar's most poignant reflections on the crucifixion, which connects the mysteries of Christ's death, descent into hell, and resurrection to an unexpected paradigm for church. In Mysterium Paschale, the mystery of Easter, von Balthasar highlights how, at the crucifixion, quote, behind the disappearing church of males and of office, there appears at a distance a persevering element, the church of women who followed him and ministered to him, end quote. These women stand aghast as they face abject desolation and, surprisingly, quote, The only active participant is an outsider on whom the cross is imposed. Along with the two malefactors with whom Jesus crucified forms a new community of the condemned. They it is who enjoy now preeminence over against the elect, end quote. Present alongside these unexpected witnesses, these despised and abandoned, Balthazar notes, quote, the Johannine account brings a mysterious clarification. The presence of a church of love at the foot of the cross, in contradistinction to the absent church of office, represented above all by the Mater Dolorosa and the disciple whom Jesus loved, to whom he entrusts his mother, a nucleus, here stepping forth into visibility of the church, visibility of the church which stands by the cross, and which afterwards, in the question addressed to Peter, do you love me more than these, is absorbed into the Petrine church, there to remain, despite everything, as a residue inexplicable by Peter and resistant to its own reduction. In this reflection upon the community of the condemned and the nucleus of fidelity to the cross, von Balthasar stresses an unexpected image of church, one rooted in those shaken, shamed, ostracized, even condemned. Such condemnation is itself condemned by Christ's defeat of death. The condemned are those with Christ, and they're the ones he welcomes into his kingdom. Next, in the harrowing of hell, that which is most similar to the Father becomes mysteriously othered, absolutely. And this paradox reverses any reductive paradigm for otherness and similarity that stands in opposition to the gestalt that is Christ, reverberating in and through creation with a transformative call to love, and, alluding to another of Balthasar's writings, such love alone is credible. Far from a reductive reification of church, these reflections challenge and defy expectation, placing Christ at the center while also establishing church as a multivalent, complex community that participates in the meaning that is the law of the cross. As the incarnate crux of horizontal and vertical alterity, the Christ gestalt presents the perfect exhortation to and response to relational authenticity. This exhortation is represented in all faces, and most especially the faces of those with whom Christ most identified, those despised and condemned by society. Additionally, Christ's humanity offers a window into a world where the relation between otherness and similarity is not one of competition, but, to paraphrase an insight from Sean Copeland, of cruciform basileia praxis, kingdom praxis. As Copeland highlights, the vectors of inauthenticity and marginalization are intersectional. This is absolutely not to say that intersectionality is inauthentic or marginalizing, far from it. What I'm arguing, and what Copeland argues, is that those rendered least are othered most, and those at the crosshairs of multiple vectors of victimization ought to be the priority of a church that truly follows the example of Jesus of Nazareth. Such a church cannot ignore the intersubjective exigence beckoning in and through the other, and more pressingly, it cannot participate in or perpetuate active othering because of religion, political affiliation, race, gender identity, sex, sexuality, socioeconomic status, etc. In a piece for a recent festschrift dedicated to Bob Doran, I argued that Doran's work echoes the spirit of Matthew 25, which, interestingly, Levinas quotes all the time too, reminding us that the face of Christ is not merely present in the pews of parishes. It's visible in the silent suffering of the one thrown out of his home for his homosexuality, the refugee fleeing religious persecution, the immigrant separated from her children at the border for breaking the law while brown or black. It is here that we are all called to serve as community of the suffering servant, helping to alleviate the agony of those with whom Christ most explicitly identified. As Doran argues in Trinity and History, Volume 2, quote, Matthew 25 makes it very clear that such responses are what qualify as pleasing to the Son of Man, that is, as formal effects of gratia gratium faciens, the grace that makes us pleasing, sanctifying grace, or actual grace that once accepted or acquiesced to, elevates to the supernatural order, end quote. If those of us that identify as Christians wish to be like Christ, therefore, we must dedicate ourselves to deference toward inclusion of and service on behalf of those rendered least and othered most, including those that reductive ecclesial paradigms or images might exclude, or in abject contrast to cruciformity, condemn. My hope is that the insights from Lonergan, Levinas, Kamanchek, and von Balthasar that I've presented today corroborate this claim. My paper has been a brief, and I did go over time, but it was still brief, foray into finding a theoretical apparatus for meeting very real practical concerns facing the contemporary church, and I'm grateful to all of you for joining me. I'm excited to hear Patrick's thoughts, and I will gladly welcome any feedback that y'all might have in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I'll turn it over now to Patrick for a response.
Thanks, Brian. Just give me a minute here to set up. I'm usually the type to print my papers, but my printer was being finicky this morning, so we're going to be doing this off the screen. Everyone can hear me okay? Perfect. Well, I say perfect, although I don't see you, but I'm going to assume that we can go ahead. I find it fitting that the person who is to respond to Brian's paper is someone who has also taken on a lot of student debt in Toronto. So that's kind of a funny coincidence there. I want to first thank the organizers of this event for thinking of me to provide a response to one of the today's papers. Second, I want to both genuinely and disingenuinely thank Brian for his paper today. Genuinely thank him for presenting such a fantastic paper that I'm confident will facilitate a great discussion and contemplative reflection after today's meeting, and to disingenuinely thank him for providing such a rich paper that makes my task quite arduous, but ultimately also enjoyable. If I may, what has been expressed in several of Brian's scholarly writings has been a developmental reflection on three distinct yet interrelated notions that he has recapitulated for us today, that being intersubjectivity, ethical responses to alterity, and exploring different forms or categories to differences in and of themselves. The impetus of today's paper is a difficulty in, quote, overcoming the often overlooked connection between the ways we understand and define the church and how we frame said church's engagement with contemporary ethical concerns. Or to paraphrase a driving question made later in the paper, how can we speak of the holiness of the church while also recognizing its sinful actions? In dialoguing with Lonergan, Levinas, Kamanchuk, von Balthasar, and always with the guiding influential hand of Bob, Brian begins to elucidate an ecclesiology that seeks the recapitulation of the diversity in all creation into a cruciform image that recognizes and respects the intersubjective nature of human creatures. Brian's work speaks for itself in its orientation towards a larger and more totalizing project that fills, quote, the gap between the theories and methods of the theologians we read and the concrete experience of lived faith, end quote. It is a crucial project for not only the preservation of the church at the level of our time, but arguably is a recovery of the biblical church for which both Bob and Brian find poignantly illustrated in Matthew 25. And as you've added today, also apparently Levinas finds it here as well, or quotes this passage quite often. What I would like to reflect upon today, however, is potential avenues of insight Brian's paper inspires and ways that I've appropriated the themes of the paper. I find it also providential, and I take a little aside here, that for those who may have been raised in Canada or spend a lot of time here, one of my favorite rock bands of Canada, Alexis on Fire, about 2 days ago, just came out with a new single after like 13 years called Sweet Dreams of Otherness. And it was somewhat kind of just coincidental, but I find a little providential to maybe work its way into this event's theme. So, I read here, and the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Put off your shoes from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The prophetic response, the vulnerable, gently muttered, yet surprisingly courageous proclamation of Here I am in the presence of God, I believe, acts as a key in Brian's reading of Levinas to understanding not merely an expansionary ecclesiology, but to serve as a uniting principle to human experience. The indexical in the proclamation can be interpreted as a symbol containing what is inherent to all symbols, according to Regis, a reality of double meaning. In a preliminary interpretation, the indexical, of course, serves its basic meaning, to act as an indication of the prophet's physical presence, both in the spirit of the Lord and on the holy ground for which he has stumbled upon. Inspired by Brian's paper, I would like to push the second symbolic imagery of the indexical to expand it to not simply be true of the location and time of its utterance, a truth inherent of all indexicals, but that the here of the prophetic statement be indicative of all human response across time and space. Brian has outlined in his paper that for Levinas there is no establishment of an I without the recognition of the other, which is crucial to the constitution of the subject. That a linking of being in a realm of intersubjective meaning is necessary for the emergence of an I in both the dispositional and cognitive reality of consciousness, even prior to any reflective act of self-appropriation. The other, which I recognize as a loaded term in these discussions, therefore I will be using it in the same fashion Brian has done so for us today, initiates an ethical reflection upon the individual where through a process of horizontal and vertical growth in authenticity, the individual will come to realize the dynamic unity with the other in their shared humanity. The failure for horizontal and vertical growth in authentic intersubjective meaning is the evil of seeing the alterity of the other as not being beneficial to not even beneficial to one's own self-understanding, but failing to acknowledge the other as substantially integral to the divine plan for all humanity. A biased disposition against the other as existing somewhere within the foreign kingdoms of difference and irreverence causes the calcification of boundaries in one's own territory to the exclusion of those created in the image and likeness of God. Created human nature in all its diverse expressions is, as Brian has established in referencing von Balthasar today, a reflection of the incarnated Word who serves as the zeitliche Spiegel im Fleisch, the reflecting mirror of flesh and time, is a rough translation, of the Father for whom we are adopted children. The role of the prophet, the one who utters, "Here I am," is not merely the voice piece of God upon the soil of this earth. The prophet is the one selected by God within the context of their own intersubjective realm of existence to realign the potentially calcified borders of a community to those who dwell outside the elected people. This is the guiding lesson of the Hebrew Bible. How do we as a community, bathed in similar and hegemonic intersubjective meaning, make room for those who lay on the recesses of our structures and institutions? This lesson is ultimately incarnated in the teachings, life, death, and resurrection of the second person of the Trinity. Just as von Balthasar stresses grace, self-surrender, and cruciformity as necessary for the people of God, Brian has stressed the need for Christians who may even believe they live in a life in conformity with von Balthasar's three notions to bring down the walls of the cathedral for the entry of all creatures made in Christ's form. The second symbolic meaning of the indexical is concretized in the marginalized and meek. In Christ's life, death, and resurrection, God has elevated the pronouncement of "Here I am" to be not merely indicative of the location of the prophet, but to be indicative of all those in need of another who is willing to approach them in grace and self-surrender. Although the prophets of the Hebrew Bible did participate slightly in the second layer of symbolic interpretation by being representative of their own realm of intersubjectivity, the marginalized of today are now prophets who require no utterance for their location or for their own work, but require the church and all the peoples of the earth to live in a state of self-surrendered service to them. Christ's earthly mission has ushered in a time of new prophets, not ones who speak on God's behalf to realign the faithful community to the other, but who live to remind the church of the other. I personally recognize this reality in my own work with the Down syndrome community here in Toronto and in my hometown of Montreal, who continually call for their caretakers, families, loved ones, friends, and church to do better by them for the flourishment of their life and the divine plan upon this earth. They live as silent prophets, those who live in the recesses of our community, who up till recently were shunned, expelled, and locked away from the body of Christ. The greatest failure of the Christian collective is a failure of service to all, not just those who live within our own isolated cells of meaning. While not explicitly ecclesiological in nature, this is the lesson I gather from Brian's paper today. It truly is about the healing that must be undergone in our own church in order for dialogue, service, and a love for the other. I wish to thank the organizers of today's event once again, and all the papers and respondents for providing such wonderful insights for us to now ruminate upon, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Brian, do you want to respond a bit before opening up for questions and discussion?
Yeah, I suppose while I have that prerogative, I'll exercise.
That's right. Exercise it.
Yeah. Wow. Patrick, that was fabulous. I as a personal aside, there were multiple connections there that I found funny. That comment was great. I also am a fan of Alexis on Fire, so that was funny to me. That hadn't occurred to me. And I also, every time I've seen you present, I am reminded of how terrible my own French pronunciation is, which is why I eschew it completely when I say the names of, say, of Ricoeur or Levinas. It's so interesting to me. I've spent an ungodly amount of time thinking about the relationship of, say, Levinas, Lonergan, the insights they provide for intersubjectivity and ethics, and I like the way you teased out those three vectors. That's actually very helpful to me. But it's so fascinating to me. I had not, I think nascently I'd maybe understood it, but I'd never actually concretely articulated the other as prophet, which is a supremely helpful insight to me, and which I frankly will probably footnote you in gratitude, or footnote in reference to you in gratitude at some point. As I'm reflecting upon sort of the colloquium as a whole, I don't know if you did it on purpose or if it was just pure serendipity, or as Bob Doran would say, providence, that you connected so well to that second paper from Kate in the relationship between disabled bodies, despised bodies, and otherness. I really don't have much of a response other than just thank you. I'm excited to see where the Q&A goes, because that was incredibly useful to me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for the paper. No, it was great.
No,
my pleasure.
Okay, thanks, Brian, and thanks, Patrick. Now we are, according to the schedule, we're actually ahead of time, so we will finish before the 12:40 deadline that's on the poster. So we do have time for some questions and discussion. I know it's been a long morning, and this is heavy stuff, but let's open it up to all of you. If there are any questions or comments or other discussion items. I'll open it up now for about 10 minutes, and then maybe after that we can move to sort of discuss the day as a whole, if there's any other questions. Okay, I see Anne Carpenter had her hand up first, and then Catherine. So Anne, please go ahead.
Hey, you quoted me, and that's embarrassing, but thank you. I was wondering if you could help me with something I've been struggling with around otherness and Balthazar's use of otherness. By the way, Jenny Martin has a helpful article a little bit on this, but Joseph Flipper has got this article about how the Catholic Church in America still speaks about Blackness like it's outside of the church. And so how are ways you treat that while using this model of otherness? And thank you.
No, thank you. It's a very good question. It's a complicated one to answer. For the record, I quoted you because this is, I made the mistake, as I joked, of writing a full article and then trying to cut it down. And I gave Patrick a slightly shortened version with citations, but it was still too long. And you saved me in the version that I gave to Patrick and the presentation version, because pulling a bunch of quotes from Glory of the Lord and Theologic and Theodrama was just way too much to include in a paper of this length. So you oughtn't be embarrassed. That book is great. I hear, I mentioned Lonergan's work with different types of differences, and Patrick alluded to it in his paper as well. I think that there is often when thinking about otherness and similarity, and I mentioned this in actually a couple articles, but one in International Philosophical Quarterly from a few years back. The reduction of otherness and similarity to a binary of an either or, whereas drawing from Doran's work as sort of expanding Lonergan, I understand it as an integral dialectic of contraries, the creative push and pull of a both and. And here, one thing that I actually have been trying to tease out lately, and that your question reminds me I need to actually write out, is the way that overlapping vectors or layers of that creative push and pull apply in certain situations. So, for example, there's the vector of othering that I do think you're correct completely. The American Catholic Church especially, but really just American Christianity, tends to, the vector of othering that church tends to use as exclusionary, whether intentional or not, in relation to Blackness. I think there's also someone like James Cone in, it's the 5th footnote to the 1st chapter of Black Theology of Liberation, will use the term Black in 2 senses, the phenotypical and the ontological, or I believe the way that he uses the terms, where he wants to, in my understanding, wildly complicate the sort of overlap of that physical understanding of Blackness and a more expanded understanding of Blackness in a way that I think parallels otherness. And it's why he's able to articulate Christ is Black. I think that the work of somebody like a Cone or a Copeland really challenges us to push up against our understanding of otherness and similarity as both meaningful and important categories that draw us beyond our horizons, but that oughtn't, say in the case of the American church, become stagnant categories that calcify into boundaries, to sort of echo Patrick's language. This is sort of a rambling answer, so I'm going to cut myself off because that's something I've been struggling with as well. So, Anne, I'm curious what you have to sort of say in response to that. I'm also curious what Patrick has to contribute because he's in many ways much more insightful than I am. So, yeah.
Oh, I asked you because I don't know. But Jenny Martin has something on Balthazar and Julia Kristeva, where she talks about the fissured subject for Balthazar, and that actually might be helpful because typical Balthazarism is he sort of takes a dyad and implies the dyad is untrue. But yeah, I don't know.
Patrick, did you want to add to that?
I'll keep my comments to myself to move the Q&A for now. But no, thank you.
Thank you. Catherine?
Okay, so early on in your paper, when you were talking about Kmonchek and the collective intentionality creating these certain entities, and how we don't, the way that you sort of put it colloquially was that we don't often talk in we's, right? I kind of wondered about the recent conflict about the priest who had accidentally shifted his baptismal language from I to we, and that had like expansive ramifications for people who were baptized by him in the last 25 years. As a person from a liturgical tradition that exclusively collectivizes, especially in baptismal language, like there's not a single subject in the entire liturgy, it was very kind of jarring to me that the idea of a collective subject or a collectivizing, I guess, creation would be problematic in that context. And really what that is naming the collective, right? And that's exactly how you framed it. It's not that we don't exist in these collectivized spaces, or that we don't understand church to be a collective community. It's just that while we're doing that, we leave that collectivity unnamed. So I kind of wondered where you would see that intersecting with this kerfuffle with the baptismal liturgy.
You're gonna get me in trouble, Kate. I have to be honest. My mom texted me about that kerfuffle, like that word. Multiple people asked me about it, and I very intentionally avoided engaging that kerfuffle because I don't know. I'm not a liturgical expert, but I have to admit that hair splitting really drives me up a wall. And I feel like a very particular type of to actually quote Father Alex Galitzin, whom I know you're a fan of as well, being, as he once referred to Nestorius, a terminological fuss budget, can I think have very practical and real consequences in people's lives and in their identity. And as I understand that conflict and my sort of limited understanding in that kerfuffle, the question had to do with formulation and whether validity was present independent of the use of the precise formulation. I wouldn't speak to that because that's above my pay grade. I tend to think it still was, but it's interesting to me, again, just like Patrick pointed something out that I had never really thematized. The presence of this we perduring independent of articulation is something that's in everything I've ever written, but that I've never really written out unto itself. I feel like the ecclesiological insights of somebody like a Kamanchik extend into sacramentality because, I mean, what are we talking about when we're talking about the language of baptism? It's incorporation into the mystical body. But that image is itself both singular, insofar as body is a singular word, but also inherently plural. So I think you're onto something there. I need to think about the exact ramifications of that a little bit more. It's fascinating. I know we've talked about this, but I didn't realize that the language was collectively first person plural in the Eastern Orthodox rites of baptism. That's fascinating to me, and I really like it. So thank you. I'll defer to other people because I talk too much.
Eric, I guess your hand is up too. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So I said contra about that, but I'm not going to give the said contra right now.
When I saw your hand was up, I knew there was going to be something. Yeah.
It's not about that. My hand up was before that.
I know.
I'm sort of fascinated by something I mentioned to some that I had to miss the first part of the session because I was giving a metaphysics lecture, and I've lectured on act and potency many, many times, and probably discoursed to more people than cared to listen to me about act and potency as well. But I was struck by something new this time when I was reading book Theta in the Metaphysics, and it was Aristotle's definition of potentiality. And his definition of potentiality is a principle of change in another thing or in itself insofar as it is other. And so what stood out to me for the first time, I mean, really ever reflecting on Aristotelian metaphysics, was that wherever there is potentiality, therefore, there is otherness. That potentiality always implies otherness and always implies difference. And I was struck that even in Aristotle's introduction to actuality, his road in is not through similarity. He does that later. But his road in book Ada is through difference. So I never really reflected on that before, and I couldn't help, especially reflecting on Patrick's response to you, where Patrick really highlighted that the commitment to otherness means a commitment to stepping into potentiality. You're stepping into spaces in which there's a potential for action to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And that there's a potentiality that needs to be actualized, either an active potentiality or a passive potentiality. But I think what's really powerful about, Patrick's insight about the prophetic nature of the other and the marginalized is that what has been traditionally understood on the lines of a passive potency that needs our assistance, Patrick has been able to show that's actually an actuating potentiality, that it's a call, and in that way it actually imitates the divine call to not just do but to live, to be. And we've talked about before about the strangeness of intersubjectivity being real, but being a structure that needs to be actuated or actualized in interpersonality. And so I just wanted to offer that as that potentiality always implies otherness, and that seems to really resonate deeply, both in terms of the sphere of action that we're called to vocationally, as you highlighted in your paper, and I think also opens up some avenues for thinking about the actuation of intersubjectivity in intersubjectively spontaneous acts.
Thank you, man. That's really interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. Glenn Morrison, I think I have the book here. He has a book, Theology of Alterity. He works primarily in phenomenology, and he's written quite a bit on Levinas. The book is sort of drawing Levinas into a conversation on Christian praxis, but Balthazar is his primary dialogue partner in that sort of task. And he stresses this language of radical passivity. But you're right, there is, I think in some ways, there are a couple of points at which I disagree with him in general in that text. But I think it is possible in stressing the passivity of the other at the expense of their inherent. You can stress the passivity of the other in a way that tokenizes and strips them of dignity, perhaps. And when reading that book, I'm a little suspicious of whether or not that's happening. That's an interesting way into thinking differently about that. The other thing that struck me in what you were saying, it's been a while since I read through Ricoeur's, and once again I pronounced it wrong. Sorry, Patrick. Oneself as Another in detail. I've been working on an article on it for a while, but I've gotten delayed. He makes a series of similar claims in that book, and he actually does address Aristotle, and particularly in the 10th study, I believe, in relation to Heidegger in that regard. Patrick, I think, knows Ricoeur better than I do. In fact, I'm almost certain he knows Ricoeur quite a bit better than I do. So I'd actually be curious if he has any thoughts about that, whether linguistically or in other, in terms of agency or any of the number of things that Ricoeur does in that book. If not, I apologize for putting him on the spot, and he can totally just punt.
I have very limited experience in reading of Eckhart, so I won't talk to that too much. But what I will talk to is, I think, Eric's point, which is interesting to me, and kind of, I think, a little bit the impetus of where the idea of the flourishment of the passive can't say that word in English, passivity of the other brings the actuality of humanity. And it's very much in kind of a response to an Aristotelian science, or what we abstractly categorize as Aristotelian science, that in an anthropological sense, we will take a definition and try and hold the standards to that. Whether Aristotle actually does that, I'm skeptical of. I think it's a very kind of later development out of an Aristotelianism. But to hold the discussion of, like I was saying in my response, of the community of that I work with, Down syndrome, if we were to take traditional forms of anthropological reflection, that they do not meet the characteristic or the standard of human flourishment, that they cannot maintain their cognitional or rational operations that would hold that too. Well, no, we can't make that the case. We can't hold a standard of humanity that ultimately allows the alterity of others to fall through the cracks. So what do we do instead? Well, we have to look at the other as the potential for the flourishment of not a standard, but of living. So I found your reflection out of the metaphysics there, Eric, quite interesting, that he begins this road in the differences. And I'll have to kind of circle back to that, because you constantly hear the critique of Aristotle that, well, he's laying down a science of, here's the subject of your scientific exploration, and you need to then observe and systematize abstract rules around it. Yeah, he conducts that at times, but I don't think that's kind of the whole project, or at least the foundation of the project. So I think that's an interesting point of conversation as well.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Eric, for your question.
Thanks,
Benjamin.
Hello. Can you hear me well? Yeah, great.
We can.
So, hi, thank you for the paper. My question was about broadening the issue. I'm always into kind of like broadening, making it a little bit broader to make this concern or this insight that seems very, as a Catholic insight, drawing on Levinas and others, making it more interreligiously. Perhaps the church, in order to accomplish the goals, the goal is very ambitious, right? And maybe to use all the tools that are needed, is that we need to place that strategy in a broader way, where people from other faiths are help everybody in the Catholic Church to be better, right? Which is ultimately what you're arguing for. And to do it interreligiously, I mean, already you're drawing on Levinas and all the Jewish influence in his thought. I wonder if there is a way to maybe expanding that, continuing that, as a way to bring the thought of Lonergan in particular in a way to other audiences beyond I know you work on the ecclesiology thing on the Catholic Church, but for the sake, as I said, of pushing the church precisely for the kind of transformation that you ask for, maybe the strategy could be a broadening, right, and inviting others. So anyway, so I was wondering what you thought about this idea, the importance of this. I just wanted to give you one example with liberation theology stuff. Gutierrez talks about theology having an ecclesial function, being something kind of traditional understanding, right? And just recently in a liberation theology colloquium, let's say, I heard a new scholar who was arguing for sort of expanding the view of ecclesia. So it wouldn't just be as restricted as before, because he was saying, well, you know, I'm Catholic, but I have friends who are spiritual but not religious from other traditions and so on, and we are living the preferential option for the poor together, right? So new type of communities, new spiritual communities. So So I want to reflect with my friends from other traditions and be able to bring these reflections into my own traditions. And I find some problems there because the language that we use in the Catholic Church, of course, is more limiting. Anyway, this is a broader thing, I'm aware, but I just wanted to share it with you to see if there's something similar that you might be thinking of.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's good to see you. It's been a very long time. I completely agree with everything you just said. And there are both in the sort of expansion of my dissertation that I'm working on for publication as a book, and in a couple of other, I don't even remember which ones, random conference papers. I've started to try and sort of tease this out. Frankly, one of my primary concerns has always been, since I started wanting to do stuff with Levinas, I really don't want to come across, and I try very hard not to come across as somebody being like, oh, you poor little Jewish guy, you don't realize you're talking about the Trinity or something like that. That's because that's not what I think he's doing. And I think that's a horrible way of interacting with people. Frankly, I think he has a lot of theological insights that Christianity could stand to benefit from having. And specifically Catholicism, I think, could stand to benefit from having. I mentioned very briefly in the paper for today that it's weird. It's almost always in interviews. He himself will reference Matthew 25 a lot, but he intensifies the language. I think I put it in a footnote for the paper version that I gave to Patrick. For him, he translates it and says that those, instead of what you do unto these others you don't do, or you do unto me, and what you don't do unto these others you don't do unto me, he makes it those that you hunt, it's as if you're hunting me. And Levinas talks about how Christ is presenting a hunting God, a hunted God, and he basically says, when I talk to Christians, I just say my entire philosophy is reducible to Matthew 25, but more intense. And I think that speaks in some ways to the language gap that you're referring to between traditions, where there are, and Didowski's done more work with this than I have, there are certainly ways in which I think we could stand to enrich our own tradition by recognizing that there are insights outside of our own self-imposed boundaries that perhaps go deeper than our own understanding of the tradition might even admit. Because, I mean, frankly, most of my friends are agnostic or atheist, and most of them are way better people than I am, I'm convinced. And I think that's interesting to reflect upon. So yeah, again, a rambling answer, mostly just because I agree with everything you're saying, and I'm trying to work it out myself. I'm curious if Patrick has thoughts or anybody else.
Thanks very much for that. Are there any other questions or comments before? Yeah, sorry, I have to check and see. Joseph, that's you. Go ahead.
So thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Patrick. And the last comment, discussion from who? What's his name? Sorry,
Benjamin Luhans.
Benjamin, good. So what I want to bring into this conversation is going off of what Benjamin said, broadening the conversation. Intersubjectivity is key, as you rightly pointed out, in the language of the we. Applying a hermeneutics of suspicion, the we appears to be limited. The idea of church, most of the things written appear to be within not only the language, but the scope of applicability. And it's being realistic, appears to be limited to one particular worldview, more or less. And the first paper we were talking about decolonizing. I think that we really need to decolonize Christianity as a whole. I am looking at what we could do that would bring about change of attitude. Most of the writings are good, they are excellent, but we don't have the will to apply like the law of the cross. We don't have the will to incorporate the other as fully human. Patrick put it well. I'm not able to articulate clearly what he said, but the sense I understood is that if we are going to relate to the other, we must relate with them in such a way that we do not denigrate them, more or less, something like that. So, and Anne's paper is very clear on this as well, because it touched on a very important chord. So, the church in the 70s and 80s, Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, we are harping on this. They are saying, we read you, you don't read us. We understand you, you have no idea of what we say. We admire you, we incorporate you, but you don't recognize us. Not only in systematic theology, but also in biblical theology. So my question now, so that I don't ramble a lot. My question is simple. How, concretely, are we able to come up with attitudinal change in relation to the other? Because often when equality is presented, it is often equality among, initially it was equality among white men, and then slowly women were included. I don't think the idea of equality has been broadened to equally, even within Christianity, within Catholicism, to include Africa, Asia, Latin America. So what has always been going in my mind is, when we talk of world Christianity, the tendency in the mind of people already is Afro-Asian countries. But no, which means North America and Europe appears to be the church, and then the others appear to be outsiders being brought in. And then their own theology is contextual theology. And then our own theology has no context. It is the classical theology, more or less. These are arguments that we know already. So my simple question is, how do we move away from these theories to cultivate attitudinal change that will bring about decolonization of the church, so that the we will actually be we, so that we are able to say, even when we are not in charge, that it is the we that is still responsible. Thank you.
I'm going to try to keep this uncharacteristically brief for a reason that's going to come up in a second. I think that in order for real mutual self-mediation to occur, people have to be able to own and acknowledge the viewpoint from which they speak and open themselves genuinely to listening to and encountering, and then after encounter, listening to the horizon of the person with whom they're having mutually self-mediative dialogue. I think that we have to, those of us that are in positions that tend to normativize their theology as if it were somehow not contextual, which is incorrect, as you just said, need to go out of our way to expose ourselves to horizons that differ from our own and genuinely open ourselves to learn from them. I think listening is absolutely paramount there. And frankly, I think that it is perhaps capitulating to the problem that I, as straight cisgendered white guy, am given the forum to answer this question. And so therefore, I'm going to cut myself off and see if anybody else has suggestions.
It might be the $1 million question, Joseph.
I know.
Catherine, do you want to contribute something, please?
So this kind of touches on why I was so enthusiastic about one of the sources that Anne had used. Korostis, if I'm transliterating that from what she had said. I wasn't aware of her, and so I had like quickly Googled. Now I'm super excited because it's an interesting thing how the Western traditions view classical Christianity, because it is not the way that Hellenized people groups view the classical age. So like for me, Athanasius is Black, right? For me, all of the iconography is of their materiality. And so it is an extremely weird position for me in the academy to be told what Hellenism is by Harnack and others. It's an extremely strange position to watch Augustine not be Black, to watch these resources sort of stripped out of Ethiopian context or even like Kenyan or Nigerian context, because the Orthodox Church was present there in this classical age. So this idea that, you know, taking the Nigerian context, for example, that's like over 500 different dialects and languages interacting with one another, needing to create a pidgin language so that everything could be intelligible. Christianity from that landscape is not new. And so this kind of project of inculturating with an I, not an E, this project of decolonizing, it's a weird position for me because it's not a reconfiguration in the sense, thanks, Anne, in the sense of something new. It's a retrieval in the sense of something removed. And so getting that onto the minds of people who think that they know what classical Christianity is and that they don't, to pull from kind of the themes that we've been discussing, like that nostalgic kind of product. They have this nostalgia for a classical age that really comes about in the early modern period and comes about alongside white nationalism, right? And this conceived category that Anne talked about of white, which was historically new. Getting Christians to understand that is hard because instead of existing in history, that exists in belief, right? So every time that I'm approaching this, I'm thinking, we need to write Christianity from an ancient Ethiopian text. We need to write Christianity from like I'm always saying, you know, like the Cappadocians are Anatolian, like they don't represent this deculturated perspective that then becomes universalized. And I think it's a process of questioning why we find universals even appealing. Why do we find, you know, universal principles or taking someone out of their context? Why do we value that? And that speaks to, like, Joseph, your comment about I think of that as like canon, right? Like, how do we get people to speak from an altered canon? And it's that layered nostalgia of history, what we think is classical, what we think we're obligated to, you know, and kind of, I don't know. I view it as hospitality, because if I don't view it as hospitality, I start to get too intense and too shrill, you know, like I start to get really peeved when people tell me about what Hellenism equals, you know, and that's not a good place. So I try to think about it as like an invitation to reconsidering. Yeah, lots there.
Patrick, do you want to make a brief comment before? I'm attentive to time, but what I'll suggest is, if possible, I'll ask Chris, if it's possible, we can always keep going, but I do want to make a formal end to respect people's time. Go ahead, Patrick.
It'll be real quick, and I won't belabor the point. I know Darren's probably going to roll his eyes because it's all I talk about, and it's. But for me, an initial way into this, and I think it goes along a lot with what Kate is describing here. It's a discussion of memory. It's a discussion of the narratives we've produced as societies in which we hold up our histories and hold up our beliefs. There's kind of a not weird, but I think a poignant matrix in narrative between the belief and historical accounts of a society. The way moving forward is I think, as Brian said, the beginning of dialogue and attentive listening to other narratives. But then what's the conclusion? Do we create new narratives? Do we supplant old narratives with the alterity of other narratives? Or do we sublate them into new forms of discussion that ultimately point to a different kind of teleological, or if we're Christians, eschatological hope? I know that's not concrete. That's a very abstract kind of process and method of maybe how to go about it. And it's a maybe, I don't know. But I think that's the way forward, of being able to recognize that the ways in which we've narrativized our past have grandeurs of our own peoples, because we come all from tribalistic backgrounds and communities. And which, in order to do that, denigrate the other. So how do we get past that tribalistic intention and see the truth and merit in those narratives and in the others' narratives to produce new narratives of self-affirmation and self-appropriation? It's a difficult process, and I think largely that's what's occurring both in the Canadian and North and American context today, that we don't have the discovery of old narrative or new narratives, but the emergence of old ones that are kind of beginning to have their place in the sun, and quite naturally are sometimes contradictory or dialectical, whether they're contrary or contradictory to the old ones. And it's that parsing out of, okay, where do we go from here? Is the great question that I think Joseph is really kind of putting his finger on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you all for your participation today. I think it's a good sign when we end a colloquium with lots of questions, and I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer. So that is a good sign, and I hope we can do so in the future, maybe together at Marquette in person. But before putting a formal end to our time together, I just want to thank all of you for your participation. I know it's another morning on screen isn't exactly everyone's favorite thing to do after 2 years of this. So your participation, your attention is very much appreciated. Special thanks to the Marquette Lonergan Project, to the Center for the Advancement of the Humanities at Marquette University, to Professor Joseph Ogbenaya for keeping us on track, and also for sharing with us what's going on with the third volume of Bob's work. It's really, really good news. And and that this to speak about this in this format is really meaningful, since he sort of brought us together. I'd also like to thank Chris Carl, who, you know, in a time of isolation, kept us all together on Teams and without any hitches. Thanks very much, Chris. And of course, always to the people at Marquette and to Dr. Bajzek for joining us this morning. And a special thanks especially to our speakers, to Ann Carpenter, to Catherine Karen McCrae and Brian Bajzek for the time and effort you put into your really thought-provoking papers, and to the really thoughtful responses from Benjamin Lujan, Eric Mabry, and Patrick Nolin. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a good day, a good rest of the day, and a good weekend. And we'll soon get together either by Zoom, hopefully not, or in person to discuss these issues further. Thanks very much.